Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to introduce Melissa Fleming. Melissa Fleming is Chief Spokesperson for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. For the past 25 years, she has held leading international communications positions with a focus on human rights, conflict prevention, and reconciliation. She travels to war zones and refugee camps to give voice to the millions of people forcibly displaced from their homes. In her inspiring TED Talk, she calls on all of us to make sure that refugee camps are healing places where people can develop the skills they'll need to rebuild their hometowns. Investing in this, she says, may well be the most effective relief effort there is. In her new book, she returns to the story of Doa, whose story she first told on the TED stage. This poignant tale of survival and loss gives immediacy to the most pressing humanitarian crisis of our time. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Melissa Fleming.
Yeah, I'm here because I've been invited to talk about my book, and I'm really pleased that there's interest in my book. You know, there are so many refugees in the world today, and what we're seeing right now are more and more restrictions, and I'm hoping that by talking and telling you the tale of Doa, a single story of one individual who represents actually the story of so many, that maybe some more empathy will be built for the many refugees in need. So let me tell you Doa's story, and let's see if this is a story. You know, my job is as a communicator for the United Nations Refugee Agency is to give voice to the many refugees out there. So when I meet refugees, I ask them to tell me their stories, and the story of Doa was one that just gripped my heart and inspired me to pursue it further, because for many reasons, and I'm going to take you through it. This is going to be a short version, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't read the book, because the book provides a lot of details. But Doa comes from the town of Dara in Syria, and this was when she was 16 years old in 2011. The Arab Spring was erupting all around her, and her family was turning on the television at night and seeing that peaceful protesters were actually really bringing about change. And the people of Dara was the first city in Syria to decide to go out to the streets and to demand of their own oppressive regime change. Doa was from a very simple, poor family. Her father was a barber, and they weren't very political. But she watched these protests with interest and went out and observed for a while until she one day saw that the protesters were not met with government officials saying, okay, we'll listen to you and perhaps we'll meet your demands. Instead, they started shooting at the peaceful protesters. These were people that they knew. There were, maybe you heard the story of the boys who wrote the graffiti on the school wall that said, you know, your time has come, doctor. And those boys, it may not have been the same boys. A number of boys were rounded up around 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, put in prison and tortured. Doa's family knew these boys and saw them when they returned home. It was a very tight-knit community. And when the government started cracking down, the protests grew. And the result was that the war in Syria was sparked in Doa's hometown. She all of a sudden became very resolved to go out there and be part of these protests, and started seeing daily horrors, people being shot in the streets, soldiers coming to her door and asking, to search the family. It was a very menacing situation. And one day, I mean, this went on for months and months. There were times when they were confined to their homes where the water was cut off. And one day, her father's barbershop, a thriving little barbershop in the center of the city, he arrived there, and it had been a bomb, and half of it was destroyed. He still tried to cut the hair of a remaining customer, but then a tank started coming in their direction, and he had to close shop and go home. So a number of events, the shooting of protesters, the bombing that was now this constant sound outside, and then the rumors that young women were being rounded up and being raped. This was too much for Doa's father, and they made this decision, as so many refugees did in 2012, to cross the border and to leave their home. And so Doa became a refugee. They went to Egypt, a place where at that time the government was very welcoming. It was Mohammed Morsi, Muslim Brotherhood. They considered Syrian refugees to be their brothers and sisters. They assisted them, but that didn't last long. There was a coup, and then suddenly the people in the streets who used to nod and smile at them started to become hostile. Doa spent her evenings chatting with her friends who were back in Dara, longing to go back. She spent her days working in a factory, earning meager wages, and her family was struggling with very little money. She was determined that she was going to go back to Syria. They were living in a flat like this, like so many, that's her dad, Syrian refugees, in most living in cities, but most living in rundown, dilapidated apartments. My organization, UNHCR, doing what it could to try to help them, but because international funding is always too little to help the numbers of refugees out there, they were living a very, trying existence. So one day, though, Bassem arrives they're up near Alexandria in Egypt, and he is a Syrian refugee, and he sees Doa for the first time and falls immediately and madly in love, and she doesn't want to have anything to do with him. For the longest time, he tries everything. He tries to pry her with gifts, and then she refuses the gifts. He gives the gifts to her sisters. Her sisters start to love him, and then he befriends her mother and starts helping the family. And Doa was the more he did this, the more turned off she was. Until one day he said to her, "Okay, Doa, you've refused me too much, too many times. My heart is broken. I'm returning back to Syria, and I'm going to join the fight." And that's when Doa realized she was just being really stubborn. This is part of her character. And that actually she really loved the guy too. And so they fell in love. They got engaged. And he then said to her, "Doa, I'm working in this coal factory. We have this grinding existence. I'm getting these messages on Facebook, and my friends have made it to Europe. They just had to, pay large sums of their money, okay. The trip on the Mediterranean Sea was pretty awful, but they sent me a picture from Amsterdam or from Munich, and they're going to school, they're studying, they're in a peaceful place, they're able to restart their lives." Well, Doa had this mortal fear of the water. When she was 6 years old, she had this near drowning experience, and she never got near the water again. She refused to learn how to swim. And she said to Bassem, "No way, absolutely not. And haven't you heard about the people who don't make it, who die on the Mediterranean, who drown? Don't even put my toes in the water." And he, night after night, kept talking to her and say, "I will promise I won't put you in danger. I promise it'll be worth your future, and then you can help your family. Once you get to Europe, you can bring your family under a family reunification program." And that's kind of what got to Doa. She was very concerned about her father and her family, and that there was no future for them there in Egypt. And so she finally agreed, and they gathered together their life savings, $2,500 each, which for them was an absolute fortune. Doa sold her jewelry, and they handed this over to these smugglers. And these smugglers, of course, told them that they were going to go on a ship, like a cruise ship, a tour that would be nice and safe. And It would take only 4 days, and then they would reach the shores of Italy. Of course, they didn't really believe it would look like a cruise liner that the pictures that they showed, but they never imagined that it would be as horrific looking as when they saw it. They left from this beach. Actually, we took this picture during the day. It was actually in the dark of night. They made 2 attempts before and actually were thrown in jail for 10 days each. Doa was in really poor health, and she actually had anemia, and yet the more she tried and the more it wasn't working, the more determined she was that they were going to make it happen. And on that fateful night in September 2014, they arrived at this beach in the night, and they were hundreds of them that had been bussed in. And the smugglers had guns, and they were shouting at them to, run to the edge of the beach. There were, of course, Egyptian authorities who were trying to stop people from doing this. And when Doa and Bassem got into the water, they were pushed onto a dinghy that led them out to a boat that looked something like this. I asked Doa to identify what it looked like. Not the kind of cruise ship that the smugglers promised. It was a rusty, old, dilapidated fishing boat. And already there were hundreds of refugees on that boat. And they were pushed on, and when the boat was full, there were 500 refugees on that boat, and 100 of them were children, like these 2, Sandra, who was 6 years old, and little Masa, 18 months old. They were crammed together on that boat, shoulder to shoulder and feet to feet. Doa and Bassem were on the top deck, and it was a boat of horror. If you see the chapter that I wrote on this boat, I do call it the boat of horror. The toilets were overflowing. There was only stale bread on offer. People were getting sick, and they had to change boats also several times. And after 4 days in this boat on the water, they collectively asked the captain, "How much longer until we get there?" And the captain said, "No worries, it's only going to be about 17 more hours, and you will reach the shores of Italy." And at that point, all the passengers who had actually, in solidarity with each other's misery, had gotten to know each other, started breaking out in song. And there was the sun it was dawn, the sun was shining, and they felt very optimistic until Doa then looked over her shoulder and saw this boat approaching them at full speed, and there were 10 very menacing-looking men on that boat, and they came just suddenly to the side of the boat where Doa and Bassem, beneath the side of the boat where Doa and Bassem were sitting and holding onto the rim, and started ramming into the boat and hurling pieces of wood and shouting terrible insults. And then they sped away and turned around and came back and then rammed another time into the boat. And this time they created a hole in the side of the boat. And the boat suddenly sank. And so all the people below deck were doomed. And Doa finds herself, the boat is sinking down in this direction, and finds herself in the biggest nightmare she can ever imagine, knowing that she's going to be falling into the water. Loses her grip of Bassem, and has no choice but to hold on to the rim as the boat is sinking, and actually watches as she sees a child being cut up in the propeller of the boat. And Bassem is yelling to her and saying, "Doa, let go, or otherwise you're going to fall into that propeller too." And so she let herself go and dropped into the water and ended up stuck actually under these plastic sheeting that they had been using for shade, and feeling as somebody was pulling on her hair, somebody who was drowning in desperation. And she managed to break free and managed to pull herself out from this plastic and started waving her arms and legs and say, "This is swimming." And Minutes later, Bassem approached her with a child's floating ring, the kind that we give our toddlers to stay afloat in swimming pools. And she's a very slight, young 19-year-old woman, and so she crawls on top of this floating ring and dangles her arms and her legs over the side. And Bassem is treading water next to her. And there are only about 100 survivors left of those 500 on that first day. And they're all praying for rescue. And after that first night, Doa and Bassem watch as men in the distance take off their life vests and commit suicide by drowning out of despair because they've lost their wife or their children. And Bassem is also getting very weak, and he's starting to say things to Doa that really worry her, like, Doa, I'm really sorry I put you in this position. You're the love of my life, but I don't know if I can go on. And she's saying, Bassem, please carry on. You're the love of my life too, and we'll make it to Sweden. We will get married. And all of a sudden, an old man approaches them. He's about an elderly, a grandfather, they thought, and he's floating on this gas canister, and he has this tiny baby on his shoulder named, he tells them, Malik. She's only 7 months old. And she says to Doa and looks her in the eye and to Bassem, please take this child. I've just lost 27 members of my family. I fled from Gaza, and I'm not going to make it either. But please try to rescue this child. Take her as your own. And Doa then takes the baby and places her on her heart. And meanwhile, Bassem is hallucinating and getting weaker, and she's doing everything to try to keep him alive and with her words and her prayers, but it doesn't take long, and Doa has to watch as the love of her life slips from her grip and drowns before her eyes. So before I go further with this story, I just want to take a pause and draw out a bit and ask why refugees. This is the slide I missed. This is what she told me that floating ring looked very much like that she was surviving on. So why do refugees like Doa take these kind of risks? And I want to just pull out to the bigger picture for a moment. We're in a situation now where there are over 60 million people who are forcibly displaced in this world today, and that is more than any time since World War II. This is a result of conflicts that are not being ended and new conflicts that are emerging, and very, very dramatically, the Syrian conflict. Just try to imagine this and try to put it in perspective. This means that every 24 minutes somebody is forcibly displaced from their home, from war, violence, persecution. Or looking at another way, 1 in every 113 people on earth is an asylum seeker, is internally displaced in their country, or is a refugee. And the difference is between a refugee and an internally displaced person is a refugee crosses an international border. So this is a picture I took in Syria, in the city of Homs. I think many of you have seen images of Aleppo recently. This is what they're fleeing, and I wish I didn't have to put these slides up to remind large numbers of people in the world today who are trying to distort the people who are fleeing and saying there's no reason for them to leave their countries. But they are, and they continue to flee and cross international borders and end up, for the most part, in refugee camps like this one in the desert in Jordan, where they live a very difficult existence. And one of the things I also want to say is one would have you believe that all the refugees are coming to the United States if you listen to the politicians, or to Europe. But actually, the vast majority of refugees are in developing countries. They are in the countries, if you just take the Syria situation, they're in the countries neighboring Syria, 5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Egypt. And these countries have been under-supported, frankly, in their generosity of hosting so many. And organizations like mine, UNHCR, and the other wonderful organizations that are trying to help are pretty much underfunded. And I just wanted to leave you with this figure. In protracted refugee situations, the average time a refugee will spend in one of those situations is 20 years. So, I mean, right now with the Syria situation, it's been 6. But this is a situation where, and I could go on and on about that, it's a really, really difficult and grinding life. Most in developing countries underinvested. In the Syria situation, only half the children are in school because of lack of investment in schooling and things like that. So very short-sighted, and these could be the future peace builders and architects and engineers, and yet they are languishing in these kinds of situations. So it's really no wonder that you see refugees taking to the seas and trying to find a life that's less grinding, more hopeful, and that's the reason why Doa and so many other people cross the Mediterranean Sea in search of a better life in Europe. And so now I'm going to take you back to Doa, and it's day 3 on the water. Somebody did a sketch for me who was inspired by the story of what Doa probably looked like with little Masa and little Malik. The numbers of survivors after the 3rd day were going down, and there was no food and no water at all. And these poor little babies were, of course, agitated, and Doa did her best to try to sing to them and play little games with them and rub their arms when it was cold at night and sing words and say words to them from the Quran. They were becoming weaker and weaker, and on day 4, though, in the water, Doa saw something that she thought was maybe a mirage or a vision, but she looked up into the sky and there was an airplane above her. And so she waved her arms, and so did at that point, only 11 other survivors, and hoped that rescue would come. But that plane sped away, and hours went by. And she was starting to lose hope again until she saw in the distance this ship. And this was a merchant vessel called the JPO Japan that was carrying, it's a chemical tanker. And she started waving and crying, and all of the survivors started waving and calling, and it was getting dark. It was turning dusk, and it was getting windy, and she was just hoping against hope that this boat would come. And I actually talked and interviewed for the book the captain and some of the crew on this boat, and they told me that they were just on their way to Gibraltar when they got a radio signal from Malta giving them coordinates and saying there's been a shipwreck, please go there. And so they went to were headed to this place when the captain got another radio call from another merchant vessel who had gotten there before him and who'd said to him, don't bother, that there are only corpses out there, everybody is dead. And the captain made a decision then and said, you know what, I'm not going to give up until I see for myself that there are no survivors. And he ordered his men to turn on all the searchlights and to put down their lifeboat and to go into the sea. And at first they also only saw corpses, but at a certain point they started to hear this faint woman's voice. And the wind unfortunately kept blowing the voice away, so they kept following the voice and not finding her. It took about 2 hours when they finally connected. And they were stunned when they held out this pole to Doa. She pulled on it and then lifted this thin black coat that she had that was covering the babies, and they saw these 2 small children on her chest. Pulled them up one by one. They were completely limp. And Doa at that point told me that she was trying to push away and go drown with Bassem, but they told me she was so weak at that point that they could just easily lift her up onto the lifeboat. And they took her up onto the vessel, radioed the doctors in Malta, tried to get advice, and they told them what to do. There was a medic on board, but that was it. And they did everything they could to revive them and to get them warm. And a helicopter was coming from the Greek Coast Guard. But unfortunately, little Malik died on that boat before the helicopter could arrive. It was just broke Doa's heart. And Doa and Massa were taken to the island of Crete. Massa was taken to a pediatric hospital where the doctors told me she was on the edge of death and could not believe the state she was in, and did everything that they could medically, but also, I don't know if anybody's Greek here in the audience, but the Greek people are some of the most hospitable people on earth, and they're very loving and caring. And so they not only gave this baby the best medical care, but they gave her all the love that you can imagine, hugging her and singing to her. And after a short time, little Massa pulled through, and that's the picture of her when she wakes up. And that's one of the nurses in the hospital. And the Greek press, of course, was very interested in this miracle baby who had pulled through. And there were letters coming in from all over Greece wanting to adopt her. Nobody knew who she was. They were calling her Nadia. And meanwhile, Doa was recovering in another hospital on Crete, and an Egyptian family took her in, and word went out that there was this young woman who survived a shipwreck and was 4 days on the water and even managed to save a little baby. And all of a sudden, all of these messages started coming in from family members of the people on board the ship, because of course they hadn't heard from them in about 8 days. By then it would have been maybe 10 days. And asking Doa, hey, do you know what happened to my father, my brother, my sister? And one of those messages that came in said, Doa, I believe that you might have saved my niece, Massa, and it contained this photo. And it was from Massa's uncle, who was a refugee in Sweden who had arrived a year earlier. And after months of go back and forth and court cases and DNA tests, he was able to bring little Massa to join him in Sweden, and she's now with at least her family. Her older sister had actually gone ahead. And Doa was also recovering and doing well. She even won the Academy of Athens award for bravery. But she still wanted more than anything to make it to Sweden. She was worried about her family back in Egypt because the smugglers got wind that she had survived from the press reports and showed up at her mother and father's apartment and started threatening, basically said, we know the names of your daughters, and very menacing. The parents were really afraid, and my organization was then able to resettle them. And they ended up all together January this year this is her with her siblings, in a snowy village in northern Sweden. And they're learning Swedish and they're going to school, and in a way it's a happy ending. And she also won, you probably heard of OPEC, the OPEC Funds Award for Bravery early this year, and that's going to contribute to her education. And she wants to be a lawyer someday, and she wants to fight for justice and hopefully return to Syria. But I just want to go a little bit into, again, the bigger picture. Since Doa's rescue, this was in 2014, I think you all remember the wave of refugees that followed her and started arriving in the Mediterranean in Greece, many of whom died along the way. But there was an initial welcome, warm welcome in Europe. I took this picture in the Vienna train station. And there were signs like this all over the place. And even the authorities in the city of Vienna were writing welcoming signs to the refugees who were arriving. But even the tabloid newspapers in Germany were providing welcome. They're usually anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-foreigner papers. But soon the tide turned. This is a very long story, short, but because of the unregulated movement of so many people into Europe and the European Union's inability to really control it in ways that actually we had suggested, the compassion started to wane a bit, but more so that the politicians, the right-wing populist politicians in Europe, started to see this opportunity of images of masses of people arriving to feed into the fears of their voters and to start using this to win votes. And many people, I think, this is one of the situations where we're just seeing more and more barriers and walls coming up. We'll recall the lead up, the months and months of lead up, actually, that to the referendum, the Brexit referendum in the UK, that was very much associated with the movement of refugees into Europe. The narrative became, instead of the truth, which was that the vast majority of the people arriving were coming from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the narrative became that these are economic migrants, they're coming to steal your jobs, there are many terrorists who have infiltrated them among them, they're mostly men and they're all cowards because they should be back fighting. If they did come from the war, they should be back fighting. And this became the kind of irresponsible narrative that actually then resulted in the building of fences and walls and refugees being stuck in situations like this in Greece. And this is where we are today. And countries around the world started seeing that actually, because deals were done, for example, a deal was done with Turkey, $3 billion deal to keep refugees in Turkey and not arrive. So other refugee hosting countries around the world decided that they were going to crack down too. And this is the biggest refugee camp in the world in Kenya. And so the situation started to get worse. And yesterday we saw the announcement here that a wall would be built, and there will be an executive order possibly signed tomorrow, we'll see, that will hopefully only temporarily put an end to the refugee resettlement program in the United States. As it says in the directive that was leaked, it would particularly impact Syrians who would be indefinitely stopped from being resettled into the United States. I believe that this all runs contrary to what actually the citizens, according to polling that has been done, if people are asked and if people understand that the people who are trying to arrive are fleeing war and persecution, generally the citizens of most countries believe that they deserve to be welcomed. There is a refugee convention that actually gives countries the responsibility who've signed it to allow people who are seeking asylum to seek sanctuary in their countries. So I think some of the policies that have been introduced run contrary to actually what people believe. So I just want to end this by making an appeal on behalf of Little Massa and also on behalf of DOA, that we take the time as citizens who care to get to know the stories of at least some of the people who are fleeing for their lives, and find a way to try to help them and allow them to have a peaceful existence, a peaceful refuge in our country and in other countries in the world. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really happy to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Two questions. Who is responsible for sinking the boat? And the second one is, I've read, and maybe you can shed some light, that climate change is one of the underlying causes of the Syrian civil war.
Okay. I don't think we'll ever know why those men sank the boat. I mean, one of the things that really bothers me when this smuggling business is one of the biggest, organized crime networks out there today. It's very profitable and it's quite evil. And when people are out in the sea, it doesn't seem that there's much will for any kind of justice, especially when they're refugees. So there's never been an investigation into this mass murder, I just believe, I've tried my own investigation, but I just believe that it was part of the same smuggler group that had taken that ship. They had already collected $1 million from those passengers, and they felt, why bother take them the rest of the way? I can't figure out any other explanation. And as for the climate change theory, there is evidence that a terrible drought that in Syria did drive large numbers of farmers and people living off the land into the cities, and that it was very difficult for them, and that their needs had not been met by the government, which then led also to the discontent and that fueled the uprising. So a link, it can't really be proven, but there has been a lot of evidence that, or theories that this had something to do with it. And climate change in general is definitely causing the movement of people, and we predict that it's going to increase dramatically as people can no longer live off of their land, or as their island nations no longer exist. So we're going to see more and more people on the move. And maybe it's secondary, but there's no international convention that would protect those people who are fleeing for reasons of no longer being able to live where they're from because of climate reasons. So it's going to be a difficult time.
Thank you. Angela Merkel said that multiculturalism doesn't seem to work. She suggested possibly assimilation. What do you think the remedy is for how these refugees should be dealt with?
Well, I didn't know that Angela Merkel said multiculturalism doesn't work. I think she believes in multiculturalism, but she believes very strongly in the necessity for integration and not marginalization. And this is one of the biggest challenges when you have foreign populations coming into your country, and in large numbers. I think refugee resettlement, as opposed to kind of mass influx of people coming, is a wonder. It has a lot of potential for integration because the country is ready for them. The communities have been identified. The organizations that help them integrate are already there. We see this in this country all over the place. And in fact, I was just on a radio show today where there was a caller from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is apparently they take several hundred refugees every year, and the community is demanding it. They want them to come, and the economy apparently has been thriving because of it. Businesses are using the refugee talent and labor, and the communities are, as soon as that refugee hits the ground, there are members of the community there to help them learn the language, show them the ropes, get over the culture shock, and that can be done when it's numbers that are manageable. It's a huge challenge in Germany right now because of that so many people arrived so fast. But it's absolutely essential.
But I have two quick questions. Number one, you work for the UN, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Right. So the UN is not up to dealing with this, is that correct?
I think that my organization would be if we had the funding that we put forward. It's a needs-based budget that we put forward every year, and it's generally only about 50% funded, unfortunately.
So this is the UN that does not fund this thing as it should, is that correct?
Well, we need the funding comes from governments and comes from private citizens. We don't have our own funding, so yeah, we have the programs, and we need to raise the money, and we do know how to help refugees, but
sure.
it does cost.
Yeah. Well, what I'm trying to get at is what role and why doesn't the UN? I mean, this is a major global calamity, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay. The UN is supposed to play a role in this, and they are not stepping up. Obviously, there is money around for UN programs. Why doesn't this take precedence? Number one.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, I want to know somebody who is benefiting from all of this. Which countries? These things usually are proxy situations where one faction is that is not apparent is behind it. Are there proxy?
You mean who's benefiting from the wars?
Yes.
Or?
Who's benefiting from this situation of disruption and movement of people?
Okay. Well, I mean, on the first question, again, I work for the humanitarian arm of the United Nations. So it's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and we are there to help the victims of war. And we do our best with the means that we have. We put forward, what the needs are. We also work with the governments who are hosting the refugees, and I really want to say, we believe that governments and countries can benefit from hosting refugees, but if you're a country like Lebanon, which has a population of 4 million people and has taken in 1 million Syrian refugees, I've visited towns and villages in Lebanon where there are more refugees than there are local citizens, and yet there's very little contribution to the infrastructure. I believe refugees are an international responsibility, and it's not just because you're geographically close that you have to bear all the responsibility. That's why the UN exists, to say, world, contribute to us, and we will help them. We will help Lebanon, and we will help the refugees. But also do your share. And I don't think anyone benefits from a war. I mean, there may be some war profiteers, but that's a whole nother discussion. But nobody wins a war.
My Quaker meeting has been raising funds for the last year for the Lifeline Program. And I'm always surprised that
The one in Jordan.
Well, actually, we're supporting the one in Lebanon right now.
Okay.
It was expanded to Lebanon in 2015. And that program is cash assistance to refugees to raise them above the poverty level.
Yeah.
So it not only supports the refugees, it supports the country to which they've moved.
Yeah.
And the cost is $148 a month for a family of 5. So it feels to me if people knew more about this problem, that there would be more money forthcoming for it. I'm just always surprised when it's not publicized more.
Yeah.
Because it's such an easy program.
Thank you. I think this is one of the
for.
best programs, and it's called, if anybody wants to donate, it's called the Lifeline Program. It's a UNHCR program. We believe that providing cash assistance to refugees is win-win. For the refugees, it gives them choice, and then they buy from local grocery stores. They use the money to pay the rent, and so the local community also benefits, and then it also helps with the community acceptance of the refugees. So it's fantastic, yes, and thank you for supporting it. And we do want, yeah. Yes, the vast majority of the refugees are going to remain in the neighboring countries, and we do call for support when they're there. That said, we still need resettlement. We believe that Jordan and Lebanon should not bear the burden alone, and the wonderful resettlement program that exists and is the one we're talking about in these days in this country. This is for the most vulnerable refugees. These are victims of torture. These are people who have medical conditions that can't be treated there. They're children who have serious problems. These are the people that we identify. The vetting system takes, for this country, up to 2 years. But it allows vulnerable refugees to come to a country that has better means to take care of them, and we really hope that this is not shrunk as it's being threatened to be, but it is expanded because the numbers keep growing.
Hi, so I have 2 questions. It's more like on a personal level. I just wanted to ask you, like, what truly has helped you and driven you to get to this point and just continue with your efforts? Like, what allows you to continue to be as passionate as you have been since you started this career in your movement? And then my second question is, what are the similarities that you think that you have with DOA to where that you both have hope that's larger than the sea? You know, like what is your commonalities?
Well, I think what keeps me going is when I see, every time I meet a refugee and they tell me their story, I just say, I can't believe you survived that. And then what really strikes me and inspires me is the resilience of people. Tomorrow we're going to be celebrating, commemorating Holocaust Remembrance Day at the United Nations. I remember as a student just spending so much time trying to learn about the Holocaust, and what struck me so much was how I could not understand how people could have survived that, and how then they could pick up the pieces and rebuild their lives again and move on. So the strength of the human spirit, even when they have lost everything, and the things that we really just take so for granted, our home and our possessions and our community, and stripped of all of that, which is what refugees are. The things that become really important are their own resilience and fellow human beings, and I just find it incredibly inspiring, and it gives me drive to move on. And I think Doa and I have in common that we want to tell. She wants me to tell her story, and in the hopes that people will be moved, and that they'll understand Syria better, that they'll understand the war better. There's a lot of detail in the book about the war and also the Syrian culture and the Muslim religion, and that people won't be so afraid and will understand and will want to support Syrians. So thank you.
Does having family in the United States, would that help these refugees come here like it used to in the past? I know if you already had family.
It definitely is a helpful factor for resettlement criteria. So it does help, yeah. It doesn't speed up the vetting process, but it maybe allows that person to be picked as somebody who could come, one of the 1% who will be resettled to a country. Canada has this system that we promote as being exemplary, which is, it's called a sponsorship program, refugee sponsorship program, and individuals or groups of people in a community can apply to sponsor a refugee or a refugee family. They have to come up with a certain amount of money. I think it's about 35,000 Canadian dollars, and to be responsible for that family for 1 year. And the interesting thing is that the government can't meet the demand of all of the citizens who want to do this in Canada. It's incredibly inspiring, and it's really, really successful. Back to the integration question, because as soon as the family arrives, they have this, this group. Usually, it's a group or who have sponsored them, and from day one, they're going to help them integrate. And but it only really exists meaningfully in Canada, so we're hoping it will move to other countries.
Thanks so much for coming out tonight and sharing this story, and thank you for all of your hard work at the UN and writing this book. I'm curious about the first time you met Doa, and what was it about her or her story that kind of sparked the idea for this book?
Yeah, well, when I read about her story in the press, I actually then went to meet her in Crete, and she told me the story again. I mean, in the press it was very superficial, and I spent many hours with her, and I was just, in a way, she hadn't really told anybody the story in that detail, and she just kind of entrusted it to me. It was kind of immediate relationship of trust, and then I kept going back to her, and we became friends, and then I told her story as a TED Talk, and then when I got an agent, and the agent said, this is a book, that required about at least, I think we counted, I think it might have been more, 70 hours of interviews with her. And it was really grueling, because for her too, it was extremely, extremely painful to go through this. And she's never told these details to anyone, and this is the first time it's appeared in the book. And it's going to be it was published 2 days ago in the United States and in the UK, and it will soon be published in Germany and in Arabic, in China and Brazil, and in many other countries in Europe. So many people around the world will read her story. I don't know if she's gonna realize how famous she might become, but.
You mentioned in your presentation about the deal that the EU made with Turkey to prevent asylum seekers from reaching Europe's shores. And earlier this year, there have been discussions about making similar deals with Libya, perhaps Sudan. So I was wondering if you could comment on the implications of essentially exchanging development funding for preventing asylum seekers from reaching Europe.
Yeah, well, it might stop the flow of refugees coming to Europe, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. I mean, the real problem is stopping the war. Of course, we're for more investment in the countries that are hosting so many refugees, but not at the expense of taking your own responsibility for hosting some. So if it's coupled with what we call the regular movement, I mean, we don't want to fuel the smuggler business. We do not want more people like Doa taking to the seas because they feel no other alternative. So if these deals are going to be done, let them be done also with more resettlement, more student visas and work visas, so that there is what we call responsibility sharing that's global. So it's financial, and it's also taking your fair share in yourself. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And yeah.